Seven Jacobs. I'm a social entrepreneur, a podcast host, speaker, and lover of all things love, support, and mental health. And I'm here. Catch me this week on The Jesse T Show.
Seven Jacobs, welcome to the show, brother.
Thanks so much for having me, man. I'm excited for today's convo.
Same, man. We had a great initial introduction, and there were so many things that you experienced in such a short amount of time on this earth. But you've really seen a lot of things that I think that are going to really help a lot of people. And the topics we're going to discuss today are powerful. So I just want the world to know a little bit about you and who you are. Share a little bit of context on what brought you to this moment.
Sure. So I think it's one of the strange things for me is I sometimes struggle to decide how I want to introduce myself, because if you ask me, who are you? I've got a couple different ways of answering that question. In a lot of ways, I feel like I'm still a scared little boy, and that scared little boy, and we'll get a lot into that and what brought me to where I am now. But a scared little boy is essentially what I was for the vast majority of my life, even when I became an adult and I wasn't a little boy physically anymore. Mentally, that was still a little bit, I say a little bit, for a long time, a lot of who I was. And now I'm in a position where I believe who you are should be much more expansive than that, much more future focused than that, as opposed to focus on your past self and past experiences. So I'm a bit of a weird intersection where I kind of believe I'm both of those things. To some extent, but I'm finally living a life which is much more joyous, much more free, lighter, and exciting, in all sorts of ways. So, um, everything from entrepreneurship to making a show of my own that I absolutely love, to just actually enjoying getting up every day, which for a lot of my life wasn't the case,
Yeah.
right? So to look back a little bit on what that was and all that story was. Um, I don't want to say that my story was unique or weird, because everyone's got a really unique story in some way, right? Everyone's gone through something. And I think mine pushed me in a couple directions, which meant that the life that I'm living now is not the life I should have been living, if that makes any sense,
Oh yeah.
right? I was born in Los Angeles. At the moment, I live in London, in the UK. But I was born in Los Angeles, California, and more into a couple of, really chilled out hippie parents, who were fairly carefree. But at one point when I was at the age of two, my mother fell really, really ill to a brain tumor. Um, and eventually, a few years later, a second one would take her life. But in the immediate consequences of that and the events that led from that initial event, my entire life essentially spun out of control. Um, Everything from financially to the way my father dealt with it emotionally. And all the physical and mental, emotional consequences that that had on me, um, which put me in this really dark hole in a way. When I started to eventually, I came out of adolescence and went into being a teenager and eventually into a young adult. Um, all of this unprocessed stuff started to catch up to me. So when I say stuff, um, we went through legal battles because some family members didn't think my dad should have custody of me. We spent time being homeless and rough sleeping. Rough sleeping essentially means being on the streets. So sometimes we were in hotels or on friends' couches, but sometimes we didn't have anywhere to go. And there's a very specific story I sometimes tell where we had to essentially squat in an apartment that we used to live in. We were kicked out because we couldn't afford the rent anymore, but actually it was going to be demolished in a few months, so it was actually still empty and we had the key.
Wow.
um so we essentially had to go in there, go into my old closet. The one bedroom in the flat had a closet with some carpeting on the floor, and that was the would have been the warmest place in the house. So that's where we laid down with our bags and as pillows and our jackets as blankets. It was just me and my dad kind of dealing with this. We didn't really have any other family there. Eventually, we had some support and reliance on the rest of my mom's side of the family. My mom is from LA, but my dad's side of the family is from here. Um, so that became eventually that became the escape, but in those moments it was very much just us, and as an 8-year old I don't think I knew how to process that, right? I remember the next day getting up at school, getting up the class, a third grader. I went up to get a tissue or something, so I was standing up and looking over the whole class. And I remember very, very clearly just thinking, no one here has any idea what I went through last night, because my school was in a pretty nice area, so none of the kids there would have experienced anything even remotely like that.
Right.
Um, and I mean, what a thing for an 8-year-old to think, right? Jesus, man. So that I didn't really deep that until I was older, because that was just that was just what life was for me, right? Eventually, we moved to the UK to be with family, and things were physically more stable. But then all those things I experienced, and there's going to be lots more within that I either have glossed over or don't even remember, that my brain blocked out for whatever reason. But when all that's finally started to catch up to me, when I got old enough to process it, I think it just hit me all at once and I couldn't process it. And so what that led to was a period of my life, your teenage years, which are supposed to be a time of self-discovery a little bit. Should be a time of fun because you're still young enough. You're not supposed to have loads of responsibilities yet, stuff like that. It became a time instead of me being very afraid of the world and me feeling like I had absolutely no value. So when I got older, I learned what the word paradigm meant. Essentially, the lens through which you see the world, and I had to do a lot of work to change my paradigms, to rescript. But my paradigm at that point was definitely something along the lines of I don't matter and I am not good enough.
Mm.
And that was how I saw myself in relation to the world. The world did not give a shit about me, and I have nothing to contribute to the world. Why am I here? And so that led to a very intense period, most of my teenage years, basically, which was just full of very intense depression, very intense anxiety, social anxiety. So I didn't really have any friends. I struggled to communicate with anyone. I basically stayed at home, played video games to escape from the real world, went to school, and came home and did that again. You know what I mean? That was my whole life for about 4 years, to the point where when I look back on those years now, I can't remember anything within them except moments of very, very intense suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts, a very intense depression that I'm surprised nobody noticed, because I would have moments where I was curled up, just absolutely howling because I was in so much
Wow.
pain. It was like so deep. You know, when your pain is so deep within your heart that you have this very natural human reaction to just let it out. Those are pretty much my only memories from the age of 12 to 16. I don't really have many memories aside from those moments. Um, and not to say that it happened all the time, but it was frequent enough, you know. Um, sometimes daily, definitely weekly. So I was in this very, very strange place where I didn't see a future and I didn't feel like I had any skills. So when I hit the age of 16-ish, something in my brain just snapped and I just went, this isn't good enough. And I don't know what triggered that. It just happened.
Yep.
As far as I know, from my current ability to perceive what happened, that's as much as I know. So I started forcing myself out of my comfort zone and into new opportunities. But that comfort zone was very, very small. So pretty much everything felt like a huge challenge. And I started to describe it as playing catch up. Socially, I was playing catch up with the people I started to make friends with. I wasn't very socially capable. Physically, because I didn't move much, I wasn't physically very capable. Um, Intellectually, emotionally, I spent so long running from things that I wasn't very capable. So it's just in all these different ways, I felt like I was playing catch up, but I kept pushing myself through that. I just kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. Eventually, I just something along the lines there went right in a few ways, and the years later, so I'm almost 22 now, and the years later, I have gotten very into entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. I've helped found multiple businesses. And like I said at the beginning, I've got a life that I'm much more in love with, and I'm a person that I'm much more in love with. So
It's beautiful.
things have radically changed as a result of pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. In a way, it's a little bit like it's a little bit like if you tried to punch down a brick wall, right?
Mm,
It doesn't feel like you're getting anywhere, but then if somehow you got stronger, or eventually you kept going until you found some tools, you're chipping away at that wall, and eventually it'll break down. And that was pretty much my journey of growth. And there's a lot within that I'm sure we'll get into some of it, but that's pretty much the overview, man.
dude, number one, thank you for sharing that. It's powerful, and it's your vulnerability is a gift, but it seems like second nature to you because it's your journey. But it's a lot of people that are listening to this are gonna take home some insights and get the feels. And there's a lot of things I feel like we should cover and based on that story. And the first thing I want to know before we kind of dive into like mental
Mm,
health and different things is what was your dad doing during this time? Like, what was his
mm,
mindset? What was he doing to potentially, if
yeah.
he was, father you, or like was he trying to show up for you, or was he just so consumed by this awful situation that he couldn't show up
Mm,
for you? And like, what was his response to these guttural moments where you were howling because you were in such pain?
interesting. Um, I get what you mean. It's a bit of a strange one for me because I try my best to understand people objectively, even when it's almost even with a parent, it's almost impossible. I try my best. Um, my dad was never someone who was meant for a life of responsibility.
Mm,
I'd argue he's never really should have had a child. Whether my mom had been healthy and they'd had a long, happy life together, healthy and stuff, I still just don't think he's a very responsible person. Very grew up in a very becoming a fairly selfish person. So it's strange because I do believe he tried his best to to help me get by, to keep me alive and keep me going for the potential of some kind of future which was better. And that I have to give him credit for because um I have heard stories of people who do just absolutely shut down. Um he had a bit of pressure from my family over here in the UK who wanted him to desperately keep me because we didn't really have any other family. So, like my grandmother, for example, desperately wanted him
sure.
to put the effort into to keep a hold of me and keep me safe. But generally speaking, um, it was it was essentially a case of I don't think he knew how to show up. I
Mm,
think my standards for someone trying their best are just much higher than his ever have been, and that's just unfortunately the truth. And so, financially, he struggled to ever work. His mindset after he turned 40 was, "I'm too old now, no one's gonna hire me." Um, and so, and when he turned 50, that got even worse. So he kind of was a little bit self-employed and managed to make a bit of money, but we mostly relied on financial support from our family abroad. Um, and mentally, I don't think he coped well. There were a lot of angry, stressful situations, which I think exacerbated my stress as a small child.
right.
And then for a couple of years, I was living with my aunt, so I only saw him once every couple of weeks. And I think that was again his way of like, okay, I need a little bit of space from this, which on one hand probably gave me a more stable environment. I don't really mind that it was the case, but I think it just kind of goes to show his overall mental state and his capabilities just didn't quite live up to what was needed for me to come out of this difficult situation as happy as possible. Does that kind of make sense? It's weird. Like he did his best, but his best could have been improved through whether it was discipline or skills or support from other people. I don't think he was I because of the life I had, I've learned to be very, very independent. So I kind of struggle to ask for help sometimes. And I wonder if he's the same because of those kinds of things. If that independence made it a little bit harder. But we did rely on a lot of support from others, and he did struggle, definitely.
Yeah, man, there's a lot of this narrative you're talking about that's parallels to my childhood where we were both
Mhm.
forced to grow up and kind of miss out on our childhood and also introduced
Yeah.
with a lot of pain and suffering during those formative years. And I've I do all sorts of work, personally and professionally and spiritually, and all these different
Mm,
things. And I recently started getting into this EFT tapping work, which works on meridian points in the body. So very similar to acupuncture, where they would
okay.
stick the needle in specific spots. And basically what they're doing is they're tapping into the meridian system, which is an energy system, and it can let out energies that the body stores. And so when you store enough
Mm,
bad energy, it creates disease, which leads to disease. And so some of the work that we were working on actually Wednesday last week was inner child work. And I had two
mm,
stories, and you mentioned something to this point earlier in the beginning part of the conversation about your inner child or your younger self.
yeah.
I had 2 points that I made, and again, you had a deeper experience with struggling with homelessness and without even what did you call it when you don't have a place to actually sleep?
Yeah. Rough sleeping.
Rough
Yeah.
sleeping. Yeah, I never got to that point, but I had some shitty stuff. Like my dad was a
Yeah.
30-year heroin addict. So obviously he couldn't show up, and he wasn't
Mm,
responsible, very similar to your dad, but just in a different way. And then also, my mom was a single mom in Boston, which is extremely overpriced, and she didn't have the
mm,
best work ethic. So she was doing what she could to get by, but she wasn't really getting after it. Plus she had her own shit. And so I was in this environment of basically I was fucked.
mm.
And
I
so
feel you. Yeah.
yeah, the silver lining to my childhood was I grew up on the beach in Boston, so like I didn't feel poor in the beginning. I didn't
Mm,
feel like we didn't have anything because all I knew was the ocean and the beach and playing and like just being a kid. But I did start to feel it pretty quickly. And some of the points where I talked about during my inner child work last week, there was one time, we went without heat a lot in Boston, which it gets really cold. We went without food to a degree. I remember some of the worst times where there wasn't much in the fridge or the cabinet, and it was maybe like toast with butter and cinnamon, which was probably more than sometimes you even had, right? Like it was just what it was, right? But it was
yeah.
looking at my friends and looking at other people, I knew that I started seeing that things were different. And so one time I remember, and this will get to the point of the inner child work for both of us, I think. But one time I remember my mom was doing something with candles. She was making candles. She was doing something with candles. She like left them on or in the stove actually. And it was a weekend. And I remember both dogs that we had that were like kind of boarded up in the kitchen. So they wouldn't like roam around the house. Like they were just barking, 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 barking. I was maybe
Right.
like 13, 14 years old. And I was like, shut up, shut up. Like, I just want to sleep. Like, it was early in the morning. The dogs were going crazy. My mom was out or she was at work or whatever she was doing. And
Yeah.
like, I just got so pissed that I hopped out of bed and I opened the door to my bedroom and I looked towards the kitchen and I could just see smoke coming out of the kitchen. I'm like, all right, this isn't good.
Oh,
Like, red alert, like alarms are going off. I'm like walking towards the kitchen. And as I get closer to the kitchen, the smoke is like darker and increasing. And I go inside the kitchen and there's just like grayish black smoke billowing out of that top of the stove where you pull the stove down.
yeah.
I'm like, yeah. And so I'm like, all right, this isn't good. And so
Shit.
I step over the little gate that was there to have the dogs in the kitchen. And for some reason, I wouldn't do this today, but some reason I like opened the stove a little bit to see like what was burning in it. And it just shot out a flame, like a fireball to the ceiling. And it made the ceiling instantly turn black. And I was like, shit, I got to call the Boston Fire Department. So I called the Boston Fire Department. Very quickly, they came. They came in, they put out the fire. And in that moment, I knew, I was like, all right, something's got to change.
Mm,
My mom isn't quite capable of providing a safe environment, providing an environment where this shit doesn't have to happen based on money, right?
yeah.
And so I got very like you, self-reliant, self-dependent. I started working when I was 13, summer jobs and then full-time and then all this different stuff, put myself through school and started getting very, entrepreneurial as well.
Yeah.
Started, selling things, at one point illegally, but and so whatever it took. But then there was also this other piece with my dad that I want to illustrate too, because I think it touches on this child, inner child work that I'm really trying to hammer
Yeah.
home for the both of us. So my dad one year, and this was when I was younger, goes back to the younger me. So I was like 7, 8, 9. My dad shows up. My birthday's 4 days after Christmas. So it was either Christmas or my birthday. It was somewhere in that stretch, the
Right.
last week of the year. And he comes in the house. He doesn't live with me. And he goes, he shows up at the door unannounced and he's knocking on the door. He comes in and he's like, I need some money. And he's coming to a place where I just told you where we didn't even have enough money for heat in the winter. So like we didn't have any money. And he
Yeah.
goes, I need some money. And obviously I knew what he needed it for because I knew what my dad's situation was. I knew he was
Mm,
doing drugs. And that tore a hole in my heart and my soul so
Mm,
deeply and profoundly that like I was just like, why is my dad choosing this life over me? Like why is my father not showing up for me? I didn't have those words
yeah,
showing up for me, but now I do.
yeah.
I just knew something was wrong. And so those 2 points were brought in this EFT tapping session where we did some inner child work. And I think it's really important because she brought me back to when I was 7 years old. And I
Mm,
remember a picture. I was standing in front of this house that we lived at, and I was just happy. I was just a kid. I had my toys on the ground. I remember wearing like this, I'm 39, so it was a little bit different attire back then, but I had like a white polo with like blue jogging pants and like white shoes. So it was like definitely like 80s, 90s. I had
yeah,
like my Rambo toys on the ground. And my sister Bridget's there, who's I have 2 sisters. She's the closest one I have. And I just remember looking up at the camera, the sun was in my face, and I'm smiling at my mom. Like, and I'm just so happy. And I
yeah,
and she brought me back to that moment. And she's like, look at your 7-year-old self and like start talking. And she walked me through this whole process. And then she's like, now it's time for you
yeah,
to take your 7-year-old self with you, brother. I started crying. Like I had
yeah.
like this meltdown because I was forced to grow up. I was forced to not, like you were exactly talking about. Like I didn't have the
Mm,
childhood that I probably should have had. And I was forced to be responsible, and I was forced to show up for my parents' shortcomings. And it was fucking hard. And it led to
yeah,
emotional scarring. It was traumatic and all these other things that have happened, which leads me into the whole kind of narrative of our conversation
yeah.
with mental health, right?
Right.
And so talk about your mental health journey, because obviously you had some really soul crushing pain, from anxiety to feeling depressive states, to loneliness, to abandonment, to
Mm.
all the different bad feelings. Not bad, that's not the right way to say it, but all
I
the
get
hurt,
what you
yeah,
mean.
hurtful feelings.
Yeah.
Talk about that journey for you, and like what you experienced, how deep you went with those things, and then like what you did to get out of those states.
Right. I get you. So I think a couple of things that will help us get there is just based on what you said as well. Um, a couple of things. Number one, when you describe this like soul tearing
Yeah.
time, these times that absolutely they just it feels like you have there's someone has literally like rammed their hand through your chest, leaving
Yeah.
a big gaping hole in your
Yeah.
chest, you know. Um those experiences I've definitely got a few of those. I don't know why I've never had it described like this on a in a conversation before, but you're so right. They're soul tearing. They for I'm trying to think of a couple for me. I think one of them when we first got to the UK, I think it's a good example. Um my father did not want to get a normal job. I think it was a mix of uh self-doubt, a mix of, well, all of these really negative, use negative as a blanket term, but these really negative mental states and mindset kind of beliefs, right? I mean, you've got something behind you that says mindset is everything.
True.
Mindset, his mindset was very, no, I can't, this won't work,
Self-limiting
etc.
beliefs.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Really, really intense self-limiting beliefs. So um he just there's lots of things he didn't try, and so it caused a lot of stress and tension in my household with him and the rest of my family. um and eventually that stress got too much for me, and so I said something, and then I think he turned around and said, you know, you've been alive for 12 years and you still don't understand anything, or something like that. It was like, and at the time I was like, well, I guess I have to grow up then, but it absolutely destroyed me. Now looking back on it, I'm like, I was 12 years old. Like, what do you expect? Do you know what I mean? So
Mm,
I've
I
had
do.
times like that when I've gotten older, when I was 19, 20 years old. What they do is, number one, they make you question yourself, regardless of what you already believe about yourself. Those soul tearing moments, those heart wrenching moments, I think they hit us so hard because either they make you question yourself, they also make you question other people, which impacts your trust, right? And a lot of what I'm going to talk about, what to answer your question around mental health, is going to lead into trust. Trust is a really big deal for me because from all sorts of angles, life, um, life has made me very untrusting. And before, like as a caveat, before I get into more details, one of the things I very strongly believe is that other people cannot trust you if you cannot trust them.
No
So
question.
trust works both ways.
Yep.
So I had to learn to trust, to put trust into other people before I was ever going to get it back from the world. But that's really hard when you don't feel like you've got any, right? So you're almost starting from scratch with trust. So for me, talking about mental health, um, I guess it's worth looking at it from the perspective of the experiences, those experiences growing up. What they did is they definitely left me with some unresolved trauma. Now, I haven't as of yet been diagnosed with anything specific, but we, a lot of us experience things that are essentially trauma and that we don't label as trauma because it makes it sound like it's a big deal, right? Um, I haven't been to war and come back with PTSD, therefore I can't complain. And actually, that's not really how it works. Um, so from that perspective of there were definitely traumas that I went through, whether it was things that made me feel incredibly unsafe, insecure, not insecure emotionally, but insecure physically. Um, whether that was the financial or the emotional issues. Um, these kinds of things, when I started to get older and into that state I described previously, yeah, at the beginning, things like the anxiety, the depression, those traumas, because they were unresolved, what that did is it created you know how we describe like the new normal, right? As a result of COVID,
Oh
it
yeah.
was my new normal. I think we've all got, especially when we're doing things so unconsciously, we've got our norm, and
Yep.
then if something shifts, we've got our new norm. My norm, as I started to be coping with the mental health challenges I had, was very much like along the lines of like I said earlier, like I'm not good enough and I don't matter. But therefore, the negative mindset I just described is definitely one I had too. So I would have days where I would only get up if I was excited to play a video game,
Wow.
and because games were my escape.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
and a lot of us have escapes. I'm lucky that my escape wasn't actually that unhealthy, because
I
there are a
was
lot
there,
of nights
brother. I
where
had a 2 year escape into drugs, and that was very not healthy. So yeah.
so there you go. So and that's the thing is, and if we're if we're talking about the influence from my dad, he's the kind of person who, as if he had the money to, he'd have a bottle of wine a day,
Mm.
probably some weed, most days, and he was also a smoker, or he is also a smoker.
Yep.
So he'd have all these escapes, and he didn't mind me doing them, but for something my brain just said, no, I'm not going to do
You're
this,
lucky.
which is very strange. Which I don't again, there's all these things I don't really understand why they're the case. But nonetheless, so I had these things hitting me from all angles, but also was desperate to run away from it. Which I think, as you've just said, I think that's a very natural thing. I think a lot of us, we look for escapes. So my mental health was in a really shitty state where I was hit from all angles with all these different types of issues, all resulting from unprocessed things that um, people like yourself and myself, and I've got a few peers who I've spoken to on my show, for example, who have said similar things. Like, we need to process them ourselves.
Yep.
Like, yes, the example you just gave of someone else helping you realize something, those are really powerful. But I think in the moment that you're experiencing them, you end up processing them yourself if you don't have someone to talk through, or to talk through it with, or someone who understands what you're going through. And I think that is an incredible challenge and actually adds to the emotional stress,
Yep.
because you don't know if you're right. So you've just got all these thoughts floating around in your head with nowhere to go. So essentially, what I'm trying to get at is all of these things, they almost create this little like orb or ball in your chest, right? Like it's right here in your chest of pain. And that's the only way I know how to describe it. It's like layer upon layer upon layer, and it just gets more and more and more challenging. So, how do you overcome that? And that's an insane question, because if that orb has built up over time, it's a really cliche, but people say this all the time, but it's a little bit like the layers of an onion, right? That whole thing. The only way, if there's a big orb of pain within you that you need to deal with, you need to slowly shrink it down with all kinds of different things.
Yes.
I think one thing that's really relevant, which gets to the second thing I wanted to bring up earlier based on what you said a minute ago, is stuff around the child, your inner child. One of the one of the best kind of, I wouldn't know if I'd call it a metaphor. It's more of a way of understanding your mental state, is that we have different versions of ourselves, right? So we have the inner child. Everyone's got their inner 7 or 8 year old. Um, you have your and you've got other versions of those which are either childish or they're in pain. So I've got the version of myself that is really, really anxious and scared, right? But you also have your intentional self, the version of you that is really conscious, aware of what's going on, and is intentional in doing what you want to do for a better future.
Yep.
You've got your wisest self. So your wisest self is you 20 years in the future. I don't know if you've seen, there's I think it got pretty big on TikTok and Instagram Reels at one point. Someone essentially said, I can't remember who, I think it's an actor, someone saying, my hero is myself in 10 years.
Matthew McConaughey.
There you go. I don't know why I forgot that, but I just remember his face and the saying. I don't remember who it was.
He is one
Um,
tapped in brother, man. He's sat with a mountain lion, an untamed mountain lion in its cage while he was on peyote. It's a great story. You got to listen to his
it's
or read his book
crazy.
Green Lights. And by an hour and a half later, that mountain lion was like purring in his lap.
Oh, see, I love stories like that
It's
because
crazy.
that transformation. I think when you've had a life like we've had, it's a little bit like that sounds impossible or that sounds
It's
crazy.
not.
That level of tapped inness, like you described, right? So but you've got that version of yourself to get back to that. That is 10 or 20 years in the line. That is wiser. That understands the things you're going through, and all of these different versions of yourself, you can tap into them, right? So if I'm having a really a moment of intense anxiety, and I want to learn why, I can sit down, meditate on it a little bit, and tap into my 8 year old self to try to understand, why do I feel like this way now, you know, 14 years later or whatever. And it might be that as a result of doing that, I learn, well, this type of environment is the kind of thing that made me feel so unsafe, insecure, etc. When I was talking to you, my 8 year old self, when I was you. Um, so that's why. But I'm not in that situation anymore. I am all these different things. So I can learn and I can understand. At the same time, I can tap into my wiser self. So my wiser self might say, listen, you don't even know if you have these next 10 or 20 years. What you're feeling right now is temporary. And it will all be okay. You are enough. And that is like, ooh, okay, so I can tap into these different versions of
Powerful.
myself to shift my perspective. And a lot of this, I use the word paradigm at the beginning. A lot of this essentially comes back to this idea of shifting your paradigm. So
Okay.
how did I deal with it and get over it? I think the first thing to say is I'm getting over it, right? I think it's a journey that in many ways will have to last a lifetime.
It's any
Um,
kind of therapy or healing
mm,
or self work. You're never done. It's
exactly, yeah.
always another kind, like you said, cliche, another layer, another
Mm.
paradigm shift, another way to look at things.
Exactly, and that's what, in a way, I think is so beautiful about it, because if life is journey, not the destination, then you being able to grow as much as possible is the journey. It means that there's always something exciting to look forward to, right? So I love that. As an aside, I love that that's the case. Actually, as annoying as it sometimes is, I love that that's the case. But what it means is that I've gotten into a position now where I can fairly easily shift my paradigm if I want to. It's almost, now that I know, and one of the most powerful changes was in the knowing. Now that I know more about who I am and my ability to shift my paradigms, whenever something hits me, or in the past when things were hitting me that at the time I hadn't processed and understood, I was able to go, why is this the case? What am I going to do about it? And it's, in
Ask
a
you.
way, it's those two questions back and forth. Why? What am I going to do about it?
Yep. Yep. just kind of a fun little story, and I'll
Mm,
tie back into some of these modalities or methods that you've learned to heal. But just touching base on that, because we didn't really get into the Matthew McConaughey story, but
mm.
he's had some really interesting experiences. And this mountain lion peyote one is one of them, obviously. But peyote is pretty much the same thing as San Pedro, which these are plant medicines. They come from cactus. They're called the grandfather cactus, and they give you amazing insight. They open your heart. They give you what we call downloads, which is information you didn't have before, that you come back with a knowing of like how to operate differently in the world. But they also give you this weird energetic magnetism. And so I was in Peru back in March this year. One of the plant medicines I was working with was San Pedro, which is similar to peyote. And if Matthew McConaughey in his story, which is true, he walked into a cage, as he was on this little voyage, there was a mountain lion in the corner. An hour and a half later, it was purring in his lap, because he had this attunement to his energy in this very animalistic way. I had was surrounded by these dogs that were living on this compound that we were, doing this retreat on.
Mm.
And one of the dogs was very like independent, almost like a cat. Like, when you want a cat to come to you, if they don't want to come, they're not gonna, but like they
Yeah.
come on their own time. They're very independent.
Yeah.
By like not even an hour into my San Pedro journey, that independent dog that was like kind of aloof and doing his own thing was in my lap. The other dog was in my lap, and all the like there was just like this whole like flock of animals that were just surrounding me the entire
Wow.
time. So
How
there
did that feel?
it was raw and fun and playful and animalistic in a way. Like it was very like nature.
Natural
Like I
sounds
was
like,
just I was
yeah.
just tapped into nature, man. And it was
Mm.
beautiful, because they were literally like these two dogs. There was three total, but two of them were playing and kind of like jumping and like almost like play fighting. They were
Mm.
doing it on me for like an hour when they weren't even anywhere near me. So there's definitely these things that you can tap into and like be in these different
Wow.
states that actually are legitimately, like, without being physical, they're real. And so I
Yeah.
want to talk about some of those different tools for you. So what's,
Mm.
as I wear the Tool shirt, best band ever. Um, they're wizards, man. Anyway, so for you, when did you start the healing process? Like, when did you become aware
Mm.
of the mental health state that you were in, and what were the tools that you started to be shown, given, and start? I heard you say meditation, but talk about that path
Mm.
of learning, knowing, and then healing.
Sure. So I think for a long time, actually, to backtrack a little bit, I think when the first time the knowing started was when I was 16. It was when I had that light bulb moment of shit, something needs to change.
Yeah.
Um, and Even though I had that knowing, I was so lost and alone in the sense that I didn't know what to do about it. That the actual healing, it didn't come actively. None of the tools, none of it came actively for years until years later.
Wow.
Um, it was essentially a case of me throwing myself at things, feeling awful because of it, feeling like absolute trash. My anxiety getting worse, my depression getting worse, whatever, but still just throwing myself at it anyways. In a way, the only tool I had was a level of resilience that I didn't actually feel like I had,
Wow.
right? Um, and that comes purely from a desire for things to get better. You just keep throwing yourself at it. And I that i- it's strange to describe because I feel like there must be more to it than that. But I know for a fact it was just I felt I didn't know what to do. I wanted an opportunity. I went for it. I left feeling ashamed, guilty. So, like for example, eventually I got into like kind of a youth program type of opportunity, which was a leadership related. So obviously I had been picked out for skills that I had shown. Um, and I felt like I was so much I was so beneath everyone else there. I felt like I wasn't on their level of capability, their level of skills. I just felt like I had no right to be there, and so I left feeling almost ashamed and guilty, and definitely feeling like I'm not good enough,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I applied that to a lot of different again, I kept throwing myself these opportunities that obviously people were giving me, so I obviously should have been there in some capacity, but I just so deeply didn't believe that I did. But there must have been a part of me that said, even if I don't believe I should be here, I want to be here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to keep trying my best to show up. Um, And that was my coping mechanism as well, in a way. Me trying so desperately to prove something to myself became my way of saying, well, there must be more than this. And the funny thing is, I don't think I did that actively. I think it was entirely subconscious. I don't think I had a moment. I know for a fact until I was probably 20 years old, I did not have a single moment where I went, you are good enough. You are meant to be here.
Wow.
Now, I might have stopped being so negative. Eventually, I stopped being so negative, but I wasn't positive. I was just taking what came because it's almost like when you described a few minutes ago, kind of crying as a result of what you had just discovered, this level of self discovery. It was almost like I didn't I that happens when you overcome something that you might not even have known that was there, which leaves you feeling a lot freer. At no point did that happen. I just kept almost blindly throwing myself at things and hoping I was growing as a result. At no
Yep.
point until I was probably about 20 years old did I realize I have these things to overcome and that when I do, I'll feel freer, or even overcoming them at all and feeling fear for that freeness as a result.
Wow.
Right. So it was just lots of like self-loathing, guiltiness, shame, and those kinds of things. I saw your face when I first said that, was a little bit confused. That is on a mental health note, that's a very natural response of growing up in a situation where you feel like you are to blame for something that you obviously aren't because you were a child born into that
Yep.
situation.
Guilt. Yeah.
So in I mean, mental health professionals will know this much better than me because I'm not one, but all the conversations, experiences, the learning that I've done, shame and guilt is one of the most often surprising but common symptoms of someone who has been through some level of childhood trauma. Because
No
for
question.
me, with my experiences, my line of thought, I remember a very specific time when I was 7 years old. We had no money for food or anything like that. I remember just breaking down into tears, feeling like if I wasn't here, this wouldn't be so hard for everyone. And everyone at the time mostly meant my dad, but nonetheless, that was my thought process.
Yep.
So again, another thing, one of ththose things like, what a thing for a 7-year old to think like, what if they weren't here, right? So of course, the fact that I ended up having a lot of suicidal ideation when I got older wasn't that surprising. But nonetheless, there was guilt there was shame there. So every time I failed at something, or every time I felt cringy because I couldn't keep up with my peers, or didn't know how to hold a conversation, or didn't know how to put myself out there, I just felt real ashamed. I felt useless. Um, so getting into the coping mechanisms, in a way, I had that initial learning when I was 16, but in a way, because all of what I just said just was the case, I don't think until I was maybe 19, elements when I was 18, 19, 20, um, where there was almost like a second wave of knowing, right? So if we talk about the healing process comes first in the knowing and then in the doing something about it.
Yes.
That knowing came in waves. The wave, I think there are a couple notable waves worth talking about. One of them is probably when I was 18, right? So 18, this is a story I love to tell because it's just, the imagery is fantastic. I was living in Nepal. Um, for about 3 months. I was doing some volunteering there. So I was living in a village called Barte, which was, I don't know, 5 or 6,000 above
Wow.
sea level, very high up. We could see the Annapurna Mountains were our horizon. That was my view waking up every day. But it was also the biggest culture shock ever because I went back to a place where I had a shitty bed and a whatever else, but for them that was just normal life. So I had a lot to cope with. And with me, I brought a book which taught me about social entrepreneurship. So that's a whole nother thing, and a whole nother side of my story is entrepreneurship and my career and social entrepreneurship
We're
specifically.
totally gonna run back a second episode for sure. No question. We're gonna touch into all that.
Cool, but anyway, so a part of that was important as far as my mental health was concerned was because of these limiting beliefs I had at the time. I didn't believe there was a balance of I want to achieve what I want to achieve for myself, and I want to make the world a better place because I don't like the fact that all the shit I've experienced is happening to other people right now as we speak. And that was basically, I always had this weird dichotomy in my mind where I had to do one of those things. So either I had to work for this in a way that helped people, but it probably wouldn't make me much money, and I'd probably be having my own issues for a long time as a result, or I have to get a job that I hated, but then I would hate life.
Right.
Basically, is a short version. And I learned that that wasn't the case. And as simple as that sounds, it's almost like these self-limiting beliefs we've described earlier. If something shatters them, suddenly life looks so much bigger. It looks so much more expansive, so much more capable, and exciting. You feel like there is excitement that I don't think I had felt before. So this for me was such an important stage because without the feeling that there was more out there and the feeling that there was excitement in the air and excitement for the future, um, I don't think I ever would have started putting the effort in, at least not as soon, to start putting pressure on myself to learn.
Right.
My excitement at my potential career that I had now decided at that point was going to be my life, um, it helped me understand what eventually became my purpose. Right, it helped me create a purpose for myself that I didn't previously have, and that was an important step on the healing journey, because without a purpose, why am I going to put this effort in?
Right.
Especially if your self-limiting beliefs are so intense, right? If you don't have much of a purpose, but you also don't have those self-limiting beliefs, maybe you'll work a little bit hard to overcome whatever you've gone through. But without a purpose, so much of your energy to do these things kind of dissipates. I'm just chilling. It doesn't really matter, right? That was my mindset until that time. It very, very much was. I was too lost to
Right.
have anything else. So that was the number one, is finding a purpose. A number two, I think, came at relatively much more recently, maybe only about a year ago, at understanding the difference between the what's in our life and who we are. So when I say the what's, I mean what we have, what we do, what we have succeeded at or failed at. If we talking about a deeper sense of self, the idea of the ego, right, or the concept of the ego very much means that it's become very common for us in the kind of society we have today to attach our self-worth to how much money we make, our job, how many people like us, followers on Instagram, whatever, right? And those things, they're the what's, they're the details. They might be useful in some way, shape, or form, but they are fundamentally different to who you are. And I talked about this at the very beginning because this was kind of the icing on the cake for me, in terms of learning and changing and learning to cope. Um, who you are for me became so much deeper, so much more significant. It's a mix of understanding that you are a very uh, not special in a unique way of using the word special, but a special in the sense that we are powerful beings. We have so much energy
No
within us,
question.
right?
Yes.
Um, in that kind of sense, it became a mix of understanding that and a mix of understanding that regardless of all these details, we therefore are that unique, interesting, exciting,
Have,
etc.
quick
Um,
question. Have you ever worked
yeah,
with plant medicines?
I don't. And I think I think it's harder to do in the UK than it is in the US as
Might be.
well. But the thing is, because of the life I had growing up, I'm very, very into the idea of trying my best to experience that as fully without needing things to get there, right?
Understood.
Obviously, they're very natural, totally healthy ways of doing that that help you, and I love that that's the case. And I think it's weird that our society strayed away from it to some extent
It was
over
big
the
government, big
course of
pharma.
hundreds of years.
Yep.
Right, exactly. So it's like is for the very same reasons that we should be exploring the absolute depth within us, um and to stray away from things like materialism. Actually,
Yeah.
those things like materialism ended up making it harder for us to do this. We're in this I think we're in this really interesting period of time
It's
where
a
we're
renaissance.
finally dealing that. Exactly, we're
No question.
finally confronting that. Anyway, nonetheless, though, to get back to this idea of who we are. The reason I said at the beginning, I've got this mix of who I am that I'm not always 100% sure where to start,
Yeah.
is because I am very much now in a place where I believe that who you are should be a mix of what we were just talking about a second ago, and a mix of who you want to be.
Sure.
So, a future oriented, interested, excited person about what's going on in the future. So, to describe who I am someone who loves the idea of starting interesting and exciting businesses and prospects in areas that help people in the ways that I want to help them. I'm someone who is excited for the sunrise. I'm someone who has a lot of love to give, and things like that that are future oriented to the point of this is what I'm doing or who I'm going to be, the qualities, the character, who I'm going to be. That for me very much became like who I am. This is
Beautiful.
who I should be. Um, so it's those mix of those two things. Obviously, what you've been through makes up what you've gone through and the elements of what you are now. But you can the mental ability, the ability to mentally remove those things from your identity, I think becomes such a powerful tool for healing. Because you mentioned meditation earlier, tools like that. So just to briefly cover like the tools that I often use,
I was just thinking
uh,
that. Yeah.
yeah, things like so every my morning routine is basically meditation, affirmations, um, and then some other form of exercise and things like that. And then before bed is essentially a little bit of appreciation work, because I think appreciation is very powerful.
Beautiful.
But anyway, those tools very much come uh, to reason I put that in here now is those tools were almost the power of those tools were unlocked for me by this understanding of who I am. Because a little bit like how suddenly I had energy to put work in for the future once I understood a purpose, I had energy to see my own value and the energy to improve myself as much as possible once I had begun to understand that who I am is so much more important than the shit that I fucked up in the past, or um, the fact that I've never had much money or whatever, right? Stuff like that. Once all that was the case, suddenly it became worth it for me to uh, discover more about myself. It became worth it to take care of myself better. It became worth it to put out the energy into the world that I wanted to get back from it,
Yep.
etc. So those now are my, more practically speaking, are my coping mechanisms. But it only came after several waves, to use the same word I used earlier, of understanding like uh, why, basically, why do all these things? Because if you come from a place where you don't believe these things are worth it, or that you even deserve this kind of happiness, or the happiness that can come from this, you'll never do it. So that's why the step one always comes from the knowing, right? So that's pretty much that.
Dude, I love it. And you've carved out your ethos and the why and the who, and you've got these tools that help you transcend and become more of what they call in Lakota tribe hollow bone, just someone that can be a safe container and someone who can show up for themselves and other people. And you're doing this important work, which is going to create ripples in eternity. Like we don't realize the effect that we have, and
Mm,
it's very important to keep doing what you're doing, because the more love that you can have for yourself, the more love that you can give to the world, the more
mm,
conscious these businesses can be, the more that you can show up fully and create these, you know, little embodiments of your footprint on this journey. Our soul chose to be here for a reason. Our souls are
mm.
timeless and eternal. No matter what you believe in, God, source, universe, whatever it is,
Yeah.
these things are essentially eternal truths. We're here for this experience, and so what we do with this experience matters. And so
Mm,
we're trying to learn something while we're here. But really quick, I want to touch on. We've talked about your ethos to a degree. We've talked about the tools recently in this last kind of couple minutes. Do you have any mentors, coaches, guides, thought leaders that have helped you come to this place, whether they are personal or from afar, you see them, through audiobooks or
sure.
YouTube or whatever?
Sure. Um, funny enough, I have never had a mentor. Um, I've had a lot of contacts in my professional network who have mentored me through certain things. Um, One person I know who stands out is a coach. His name is Remy Blumenfeld. He's an amazing guy. He's sold multiple businesses, and but he's a coach. Really, really supportive in helping me understand some of these very things we've talked about. Actually, um, another friend of mine is a business partner. He's actually my age. A young man named Jeremiah. Um, he has very much been helpful for me in almost understanding that I've got value to add. And that's very much through the work we've done together in businesses and entrepreneurship. But he had experiences that were also difficult growing up, but he learned to overcome them sooner,
Yep.
much sooner than I did, through opportunities he took and things that he did. And so I've learned that through him. So I've got a couple notable people in that way. But for the most part, coming back to this idea that I've been probably too independent, um, a lot of what I've learned in this regard has been through secondhand sources, like you mentioned. So, if we're talking about the kind of deeper, more, I guess you could call it philosophical stuff,
Yeah.
one of my absolute favorite books is called A New Earth
I love
by
it.
Eckhart Tolle, which
Love it.
I can tell based on what you've said. I'm not surprised that you've read that and you're
Love that
familiar,
book.
right? I love it. Um, I've also, when it comes to meditation, I've used a couple of things. I use Headspace a lot.
Yes.
The app, I think it's got some amazing stuff on there, and especially when I first started and didn't know what was going on with, yeah, like what is meditation really? Um,
Can you break down
After
really quickly your practice when you wake up? Like how much time and what
Sure,
are you doing during the meditation?
sure. So, um, it's a little bit funny because I nowadays I don't always use Headspace. Sometimes I do it for myself. My wake up process is essentially to get up because of the mental health difficulties I have. Sometimes waking up is still an issue,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But regardless of when I wake up, um, I get my wake myself up a little bit, do what I need to do, drink some water or whatever, and then it is literally sit down. I have 4 main things that I do actually. Sit down and do the meditation. Now, the meditation usually is 10 to 20 minutes. These days it's been closer to 20, but the sweet spot for it to have a really meaningful impact, apparently, from what I've heard, is about 15. So doing at least 15 minutes every morning is when it starts to have a really huge impact on you, apparently. Um, so I'll do that, and that meditation will usually be um if I'm using something like Headspace, it will usually be focused on something specific that I want to interrogate, as well as just like loosening myself up because I'm a very naturally, because of whatever's going on in my head, very naturally tense person, unfortunately.
Yes.
So it's a bit of like loosening myself up for the day. Um, but sometimes if I'm not using Headspace or if I do something extra, that's usually meditation based on almost in a way it's almost combining it with what I do for affirmation. So things like the love I want to give to the world, appreciating what is around me,
Beautiful.
and in a way I do a little bit of a visualization where I think like whatever is it's almost like if you focus really really deeply. I don't know how best to describe this, so I'm a bit of a mess, but thinking really really deeply about the being within what we are, right? The being instead of the human doing, the human being,
Yes.
and focusing on that and just breathing through it. And a lot of the breath work that comes with it, it's almost this time for me to energize, build myself up, and just increase my energy, awareness, and connection, this feeling of connectedness to the world through that. So that is pretty much my meditation. It's usually one of those two things, whatever I feel like I needed at the time. And then after that, I'll go through affirmations. And funny, I've actually redone my affirmations really recently to be a bit more focused on statements about what I am and what I'm going to receive and achieve, as well as what I give. But affirmations on a really simple level for me used to be I am enough. I am lovable. I am strong. I am kind. So essentially, the things that I believed I wasn't growing up,
Right.
right? Because those became, because those were such deep rooted parts of my paradigm. Um, I needed to reset them. That's essentially what that is. It's the idea of you telling yourself you are all the positive things you didn't believe you were, to reset your brain a little bit, to force yourself out of this subconscious stream of negative thoughts. And then after that, I have what I call my flow routine.
Okay.
So essentially, I've just done all this stuff. What I do is I stand up and I have a four phased, really quick process to just get my head very present and in the game for the day. And that is it's four parts: stillness, freedom, peace, and presence. And those are things I chose. So that specifically is something I've designed entirely myself. So it might not resonate with others, but essentially the idea being number one, that regardless of the noise or whatever I'm feeling as a result of what I've just done, or if I've been distracted after or during doing those things, let all of it go, be very, very still. And then within that quietness, freedom and peace are essentially letting go of whatever is weighing me down and feeling happy with whatever comes. And then finally, presence, that is the idea of being present, that is being aware of what's going on right now. And that just brings my brain into what's going on right now and what do I need to do next for my day of work. Um, and then my fourth is things like exercise and stretching and whatever physical health related stuff I want to do for the morning. And that is pretty much my four-step morning. And it's a little bit long, especially if sometimes what happens to me is I will feel under a lot of pressure when I wake up. So shit, I've got so much stuff to do
Yeah.
today, blah, 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 blah,
Overwhelmed.
blah, blah. And so sometimes it goes off the rails, but it's also a discipline to do it when that doesn't happen. When I'm feeling that way and I don't want it to happen, it's a discipline to do it anyway. So although sometimes I don't achieve it because it is a little bit long, actually doing it kind of saves you time in a way
Of course.
if you're doing it right, because then I'm less my brain is less noisy for the day.
You're creating
So
space. You're creating
yeah,
space
exactly.
for yourself, and you're creating margin. There's a book called Margin, and these types of things help you do that. But
Mm,
I'm gonna jump. I have another podcast guest in the waiting room, but I'm gonna definitely
cool.
run this back because I think we just scratched the surface on your story, and so much power from you sharing all the different experiences and tools that you've used, and just on the mental health space, and so many people
Mm,
that won't feel alone, which I think that was one of the biggest things in mental health is you feel like you're going it alone. You feel
yeah.
like no one can relate, or you feel like maybe you don't want to burden people with your story, or maybe you're shameful about your story. And so
Mm,
people keep it in. And a lot of times it just takes that one person to reach out and say, hey, I have an ear to listen, or I can hold
yeah,
space for you. And I think that little bit of insight can go a long way. So I want to expand more on
exactly.
that. I want to get into these conscious businesses, but I love who you are. You're amazing, mighty powerful, and I can't wait to have you on again, brother.
Cool. Thank you so much, man. Love being here.